Today I'm going to be talking through my creative process for CrossFit workout creation. And I actually had this question through socials. I had a guy reach out, Robertus Stankus from Lithuania. I'm sorry if I butchered your name, but he basically reached out and said, how do you create WODs? Do you think more about volume of movements or how they interfere with each other? Or do you think more about WODs like a conditioning piece and you are counting, quote, minutes of intensity of them? The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all one place, zorfitness.com. So a few things to clarify before we kind of jump into this. One is like the difference between using the phrase like a WOD, like workout of the day, or referring to something else like a Metcon or a workout. Now, the only reason I don't really use WOD a lot, not because I necessarily don't like the term, it's just because I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for a lot of my competitive CrossFit athletes. Like I will call our workouts of the day here at Lumber Capital at my affiliate WOD sometimes because it's a standalone workout. It's a class. Whereas oftentimes a Metcon, a conditioning piece, whatever you want to call it, is only that. It's one piece of an athlete's training especially for some of my competitive athletes. So they might have A, B, C, D, E in their AM session, and maybe D and E or both could be considered WODs maybe, right? So I would just call those pieces Metcons. Something that's more conditioning based, I might call it a Metcon. If it's often mixed work, I'll call it a Metcon, right? Versus just like conditioning might be more like cyclical based or something along those lines. And this is where it all starts to get really fuzzy, but likely I'll probably refer to it as like a workout, a piece, something along those lines versus a WOD. The other thing you gotta refer to was the duration and the movement selection. And I would say there's kind of two things that if I just kind of answer those questions more directly here, it's like I'm always considering the athlete needs, and I'm always considering the testing body of the sport, right? And for the athlete's needs, for example, you know, if someone's a powerful athlete, they just might need more conditioning based work across the board that's in the longer time domain, right? So they might be doing multiple, 15 to 25 minute workouts in a given week, and that could be very different from what you're going to see from the traditional testing body of the sport, where a lot more of the workouts are maybe in the open style, maybe like 8 to the 15-minute range, so a little bit shorter than that. And like maybe it's like for an in-person event, like probably a lot of like sub 10-minute events. So that being said, that's not necessarily completely reflective of the sport. However, as the athlete gets closer to the competitive season, that'll begin to shift and start to look more and more and more like the competition that they're preparing for. So if they're preparing for something like the Open, they're going to see more high turnover movements at a little bit lower tension and a little bit longer, relatively speaking, relative to other CrossFit competitions, and a little bit longer time domain. Whereas if it's quarterfinals, you're going to have a slightly different movement selection, versus if it's an in-person competition, you're going to get running or different odd objects, things that might not have access to at something like an online competition. Then you're going to start to involve more of those things. So that's movement selection as well as time domain or duration of workouts, thinking about what does the athlete need, and then what are we preparing for, and then you start to blend those two based on what time of year it is. More athlete need based in the off season, you might call that limiter based work. You might call that weakness development. You might call it a bunch of different things, but essentially it's working on what the athlete needs. And then as they get closer to their competition, it's starting to shift towards like, what does the sport actually demand of the athlete? Because they're just preparing for their sport at that point, and it needs to look more like scrimmaging of what the real thing's going to look like. Okay, obviously there's a blend between those two things, but that's a rough outline of how you could think about it. So with that sort of background, let's jump into my process, how I actually think about workout creation. So if I'm trying to create just a workout for somebody, right? Like let's just say I have a competitive athlete. I'm trying to figure out what do I need to give them on this particular day. Unless I create some sort of constraint or thought process around that, or like some guardrails in place, it's so wide open ended that it's paralysis. Like you can't make a decision. So I do the same thing if it's a class workout. I do the same thing for my individual design. I'll create a skeleton first. So basically, like, think of it as like I'm putting the bare bones in place of like what sorts of things need to go in different places in the week and how could they mesh well. And then once I have some of the constraints on the program, that makes it so much easier to just have a little bit of allow a little bit of creativity You can paint however you want as long as you stay in these lines. And I think if you do that, it sets you up for success in two fronts. One, in actually writing good training where it's as narrow as it needs to be and not more. And it also just like the more constraints you have, it's typically easier to actually program rather than harder, right? If you're writing a piece for, toes to bar and burpees, that's like not challenging at all to do. Someone's like, hey, write a workout with burpees and toes to bar. You're like, I could do that every day for the next, 10 years. That's not a challenging thing to do at all. So figuring out like what constraints do I need to put on there? Again, and not more than I necessarily need to be, right? It doesn't have to be down to a specific movement or anything like that. However, enough where it kind of allows me to get focused into the direction that I need to go with my program design. And that's a really helpful place to start off. And usually those sets of constraints are handed to me. Like the things that kind of narrow the program down are often already in place. So for example, like a class structure, I know that we have a certain ability level of athlete, we have a certain amount of equipment, we have certain things that we're going to need to focus on certain days. On this day, we typically have more people in class, so maybe we'll rule out certain piece of equipment. If I'm doing individual design, I have an athlete, and I know their needs, I know where they're at in their season, and I know how far out they are from a competition. And it's like, if you don't know any of those things, it becomes very challenging to program design effectively. Whereas as soon as I know all those things, it starts to narrow down where I go with the program, and it just makes it a lot easier for me to kind of wrap my hands around it and sort of process what I need to be doing. So that's what I mean by they're often handed to me, right? There's going to be certain natural constraints that are put on the program and other ones that are a little bit self-imposed where I put the guardrails in place just to help with my creative process. As I said, one of the big ones just being the skeleton of the weekly outline. And one kind of thing to maybe highlight or underscore here is that I think, for example, right, like good, effective, creative, appropriate CrossFit Open prep is not going to look like good, creative, appropriate CrossFit Games prep, right? Because those two things are different, right? The Open is obviously different from the Games. So I'm not just talking about like level of athlete, right? That's one thing, but I'm talking about like the demands of the competition are different. So the way that you have to write in preparation for that sort of thing is different. So that's just sort of a process that you go through as a coach. Is like, okay, I'm preparing for an athlete for this thing. This is what we need to get. How would we shift things just a little bit to make it, again, prepare them for what they're going to do. Do you have a topic that you'd like to request as a future show or just a question about training? Reach out to me. My email is ben@zorfitness.com, or you can DM me on Instagram @zorfitness. Lastly, head over to zorfitness.com if you want to browse all of our previous shows with in-depth show notes as well as educational content for all things training. And to be more clear, let's go over 4 different types of constraints that I most commonly put on myself or impose on what I'm doing. First, like for individual design, as I mentioned, was a template. So a template or a skeleton, meaning that especially when you're doing like off-season limiter-based training, you know exactly what you need to be doing on a every so frequent basis, right? So like maybe I just place weightlifting work on their priority days if they're weak, right? So it's like, okay, you really need development and snatch and clean and jerk. So it's like, okay, on Monday and Friday when you're coming off your rest days, we're just going to make sure that we hammer those really hard, right? Or maybe that's squatting strength, for example. Or maybe it's like, okay, we're going to do hanging gymnastics and we're trying to get a good exposure of that every 48 to 72 hours. So we're going to go, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we're going to give you some muscle up development work. Things like that. And then it's like, okay, then you just kind of filter in all the other pieces where they need it with other like lower priority work that you're maybe still continuing to touch on, but isn't as important as that work, or things that are just sort of like maintenance doses of the other skills and touches of things that they need throughout their week to make sure that they're continuing to brush up on all the stuff in the sport. So that's an easy example of like, okay, that's a constraint based on what we have in the program. Another one would be like, again, for individual design, like mimicking the intensity body of the sport as they get closer to it. Maybe more so like having the training that they do in certain like more so conditioning things starting to represent or reflect the open or quarters or semis or something like the games, or even like a local comp, for example. When I'm writing like the name game, which is a different category of thing, right? I want to sort of think about like what would be a good, maybe slightly novel stimulus that kind of challenges how athletes have to pace or like their movement selection or something along those lines. That's a very doable, plausible workout for like the CrossFit Games season that most people are going to have access to while they're at their gyms, right? So we're not going to do an open water swim into 10 peg boards for time, right? Like that's just not going to happen. It's like, okay, what do most people in our community have access to? What are the things that are going to be really helpful for driving their fitness forward? And also what could potentially actually be tested in a, quarterfinals type testing body. Okay, let's vary the looks and different movements that we get, the different time domains, just like you would probably see in just like kind of good programming across the board. And that's what we're going to do for the name game. For something like competitive programming, right? You're having athletes and coaches have a pretty, just kind of like a general sense of like what like a quote unquote like good competition is, right? So there's like a balance of certain movement patterns. There's a balance of time domains, like varying the lengths of the workouts, the workout formats. So like they shouldn't all be interval formats, for example. They shouldn't all be AMRAPs or like, you should have some for time, some rounds, maybe a chipper in there, just again, some variance, right? And people have a lot of opinions about that stuff, but generally people have like a pretty good idea of like what it would be considered balanced and what would be considered too redundant in those types of settings, right? So balancing bottlenecked workouts with just like raw capacity, right? Skills with strength, like all of those types of discussions are coming into this. So again, if you do, 3 lifts in a competition, they're all maxes and, one burpee density piece, it's like people aren't going to think that's a balanced CrossFit competition because of their prior experience and what just generally the kind of broad community consensus is what is good programming is. And I agree with most of those things. And additionally, I'll say like I write a lot of workouts and I think some of them, they're just like fine training pieces and it's appropriate for the athlete and it's like not super exciting or novel or anything along those lines. And other times I'll write one, I'll be like, ooh, that one's kind of like cool or different, or I just think it would be like an effective test of fitness maybe. And then it's like, I'll often at that point kind of like put a bookmark in that one. Maybe we'll use it as like, I'll throw it as in like a class workout at Lumber Capital if it's appropriate for our demographic here, or maybe I'll take it and put it in, to a future name game kind of document that I have saved. And like, that's the kind of thing that we can kind of silo off and like put in the back burner where I can think about it at a later date and kind of process about what orders and like what things I should put in there. And there is some creative leeway in that process, is my point. So some additional thoughts on first individual design limiter phases. So if an athlete's going through a limiter phase, one of the goals is to like get varied touches of movements that they haven't seen recently. So this is a lot less creative and just like more practical, right? Like, for example, I may keep a movement checklist where it's like, this athlete is doing squatting twice a week. We need to make sure at some point we're getting some single leg work in. Otherwise, they won't have lunged in the last 12 weeks when we go back to like starting to, get closer to their competition, and they're just going to be destroyed from not having done any lunges and then doing 400 feet of lunging or something in a workout. So it's like keeping a minimal effective dose of that can be helpful, right? So just looking back and saying, okay, the last time I did lunging was on this date. Okay, it was 4 weeks ago. We should probably do some sort of single leg work, even if it isn't a lunge, making sure we're doing a split squat or something. Or you can get a little bit creative in how you do that, and you can slice and dice it a different way where it's like, okay, obviously we're not going to do lunging work the day before we squat, but maybe we do it the day after we squat, or maybe we do it right afterwards as single leg work or accessory type stuff in more of an interval format. Again, just being aware of when the last time you did a certain movement was, and that way you can start to track that and make sure that you're not going too long before you do a certain type of movement again. So it's like, okay, we're doing a lot of strict pulling development work, but we haven't done any toes to bar in the last 6 weeks, right? So it's like finding ways where you can still incorporate some of that sort of, skill maintenance work is very important. We've done a lot of jerks out of the rack and overhead squats, but we haven't done many like strict pressing reps. So let's make sure we get some horizontal pressing with like a dumbbell bench press and a Linda format this week. And again, that's not super creative, but it is good, effective program design, which is, I think, especially necessary in a limiter phase. So maybe here's like a good example of this. I'm going to start to incorporate some examples now. I gave this to Sam Hagen the other week. It was 4 rounds for max reps. A very similar look as to like that fight gone bad type thing that we had in the quarterfinals of 2024, where it was 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute and then 1 minute of rest, 3 different movements. And then, 4 rounds of that, or I think it was only 3 rounds. This ended up being 4 rounds. So it's 4 rounds for max reps, 1 minute of alternating dumbbell snatches with a 50, 1 minute of row calories, and 1 minute of toes to bar with 1 minute of rest in between. And this was an opportunity for him to not only get some good sport conditioning in, but to get some grip limited work in, which was sort of where this was appearing in his limiter phase, as well as getting an opportunity to practice the pacing of a structured event in that format. So again, that wasn't like super creative or novel, but it was something that allowed to kind of check off all those boxes for him. And that's why I got placed there. Again, more constraints generally helpful than less constraints. Another maybe clarification would be for the competition prep side of things. I generally try to take on the lens of whatever the competition is, the competition director and their bias. Which the only way to do that is through a statistical analysis. So you look at the event, you look at what movements have come up most recently, what has come out the most. You create a checklist for those things, and then it's like, okay, what do they tend to bias in terms of formats and time domains and all that stuff, and then you just try to replicate that, or even give like maybe past workouts and things like that to the athlete as they're preparing for the event. So again, that's just simply preparing them for what they're going to see. So that's one side of it. And then it's like, once the events are known, because they've come out and they've released them, a month prior to the event, you don't need to like make up anything. You might test some of the events, or you do parts of the events, and then you train the movements in a way that allows the athlete to actually make up some ground and some meaningful change in the lead up to those events without overdoing it and resulting in additional joint irritation or fatigue or injury because of those things, right? So it's just like, what's good sound program design without trying to overdo it for that athlete, and then making sure that when they actually walk out on the floors, when they're most prepared to do those set of tests. A good example, maybe I could pull this from my own training. It was, I was prepping for Metcon Rush in 2024. It was every 2 minutes for 8 sets to start off. It was 15 count row, 5 gymnastics reps, which sets 1 through 3 were strict pull-ups, and sets 4 through 8 were ring muscle ups, and a 25-foot handstand walk with 2 pirouettes in it. Okay. Event 1 for that event was ring muscle up, handstand walk with pirouette, and rowing. So shocker that, that was my sort of developmental work for that. And that wasn't meant to be particularly maximal. It was actually pretty challenging, but not maximal. And then next was a 15-minute EMOM, 8 touch and go power snatch, 135 on minute 1, minute 2, 5 SATs press with an empty bar, and then 3 was choice mobility work. So that was a 15-minute EMOM of obviously building towards what will become an Isabel progression, and which is 30 power snatches at 135, so just basically like working on the barbell cycling aspect of that, as well as snatch strength prep. And then C was actually the snatch strength work. Snatch plus a pausing overhead squat for 10 sets. Sets 1 through 3 at 185, sets 4 through 6 at 205, sets 7 and 8 at 215, and sets 9 at 10 at 225 to 235, depending on how I was feeling. And then finally, D, every 4 minutes for 4 sets. 22 toes to bar, 90 double unders, and 3 clean and jerks at 275, because once again, that was the finale for the event, was 60 toe to bar into 180 double unders into 6 clean and jerks. So that ended up being, pretty close, a little bit over the volume that we're going to see in a test like that, but obviously interval format. So again, that was just like me preparing for the competition. I already knew all the events that they're coming out. I tested some aspects of them already, and then it's like building up the qualities so that you can actually execute on those events well, and not doing that more than maybe 2 to 3 times per week for all those different touches, just because you're already touching on those movements more than you had up to that point. You got to keep them healthy. You got to make sure that the joints aren't being overworked, where you're just going to deal with more fatigue or irritation from just overdoing it. So you got to be careful with that. When I'm talking about the name game, one of the things, again, I kind of mentioned, it's got to be fun. It's got to be somewhat unique, kind of testing of the workouts. It's got to be some sort of plausibility aspect to it, where it's like, this could potentially show up in the open or semis or quarters. And it's also, again, something that athletes have access to. We were doing a class workout that was very similar to this workout, Ted Lasso, that I came up with. And I was like, man, this could be a really fun, different type workout that, again, is very plausible and has all these other qualities that I'm looking for if I just tweak a few things. I want to say it was like a 400-meter run into ab mat sit-ups, box jumps, and a burpee chest to bar. And this is what it ended up being for the name game. Ted Lasso for time, 800-meter run into 8 rounds for time of a 9 med ball GHG sit-ups, 6 box jumps to a high box, and 3 burpee box bar muscle ups. back into an 800-meter run. So that was obviously like beefed up a little bit from the class workout, but it was something where it was like I got the inspiration. I kind of obviously created it based on what was fitting into class well, but then as I saw how that got executed, I adjusted a little bit and gave it to some of my higher level athletes that I have through Zor. So that's the kind of thing that I'll do occasionally with that. It's like, ooh, this is like a cool, fun, different piece that will also make a very just sound, good test of fitness that I think will be a good name game workout. And I think Chris and Day do similar things because they also write a bunch of those workouts, and that's a similar thing where they might write a workout for an athlete and see it and be like, ooh, this would make a good test for other people as well. And they'll give it to the community instead of just a single individual. And finally, competition. And now this is programming a competition, not preparing for a competition, to be clear. For me, and maybe not everyone's this way, but I like to see as many unique movements, equipment usages, and pairings of movements as possible, while everyone who leaves the competitions was like, wow, that was CrossFit and it was a good balanced testing body, right? So, and what I mean by that is like, okay, for whoever's programming the competition, it's like, use the venue, use formats that, challenge how athletes think about pacing, that encourages the best athlete to come out on top, not just because their fitness level. However, that's a very important aspect of it. However, also because they're prepared and understand how to go about their work to their best ability, right? To get the most out of what they're doing. And ultimately, the fittest athlete has to end up at the top of the podium at the end of the day, right? So if that gets missed, it's all a wash and it's useless, right? And if people don't think they did a CrossFit competition at the end of it, it's useless. Besides that, if you can incorporate as many different elements, as many different movements, as time domains, and all that stuff as possible, I think it is the spice of life. I think people generally like that sort of thing, and they think the workouts are cool when you do that, right? And not that that's the only thing that matters, but for most people, they're signing up for a competition because they want to have fun, and that's a very important aspect that you want people to walk away saying, this is what I did. I had a great time doing it. The fittest athlete won, and it was also like a good, unique challenge for what we're looking for. If you want to hear a little bit more about my process for workout creation, I did a whole episode on it, 152. Go check that out. I basically walk through my process for programming the competition that we have coming up at Lumber Capital Athletics, and outline that really clearly. So generally, that's how I think about workout creation for the CrossFit athletes that I coach. If you guys got follow-up questions, you can reach out to me at SwartFitness, at ben.wise on Instagram, or email me, ben@swartfitness.com. Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.